New York City, the first months of 1991. A yacht the length of a city block slides up the Hudson. The Lady Ghislaine, it's named for the owner's favorite daughter, and the man on its deck is, in that winter, on top of the entire world. He's just bought the New York Daily News. An Englishman sweeping in, buying one of New York's own newspapers, saving it from going under. And the Big Apple is in love with him for it. Cab drivers stop their cars in the middle of the street just to shake his hand. Strangers ask him for autographs. He walks into the most exclusive restaurant in Manhattan and the entire room rises to its feet and applauds. One of his men picks up a phone and dials his great rival, Rupert Murdoch. And on that phone they leave a message that says, "Mr. Murdoch, Bob Maxwell would like you to know that he's just bought the New York Daily News." Then 8 months later, that same yacht is drifting off the Canary Islands in the dark, and Bob Maxwell is gone, over the side sometime before dawn. They pull his body out of the ocean that afternoon, with the official ruling eventually being a heart attack and then drowning. In those 8 months, between the standing ovation and the water, nothing really changed for Bob Maxwell except the fact that the truth was starting to catch up with him. That man who received the applause all those months ago was secretly and catastrophically broke. The empire underneath him was a shell. And to keep it standing one more month, he had been quietly stealing hundreds of millions of pounds out of his own companies, including the pension savings for the people who worked for him. He died a thief and died just days, maybe, from the whole thing coming out. And after his death, a country that wasn't even his own gave him a funeral fit for a head of state. They flew his body to Jerusalem, with the president of Israel giving the eulogy and the prime minister standing at the grave, with a row of the country's intelligence chiefs coming to see him buried on the Mount of Olives, the most sacred ground there is. And this man was British, by the way, and no British prime minister came. The country he'd spent 50 years lying his way into didn't send its leader. And this other one buried him as if he were a king. And that is a great starting point for this video. What does a man have to be worth? What does a man have to be holding to lead to that kind of celebration of his death or celebration of his life, depending on how you look at it? A foreign government burying him like a head of state days after he drowns as a bankrupt thief. By the way, you already know this family. You know the daughter, the one who is serving 20 years for helping Jeffrey Epstein abuse girls, Ghislaine Maxwell. The boat her father drowned beside was named after her, and of all 9 of his children, she was his favorite, the Lady Ghislaine. With the insane firestorm that the Epstein files has been over the last couple years, when you hear the name Maxwell, you immediately think of Ghislaine Maxwell and then Epstein and then the island, and the chances are you completely miss what the rest of this family was secretly building. In fact, in the mid-90s, one of the search engines fighting to organize the early internet back when a dozen of them were at an all-out war over how you'd find anything online years before Google won was built by Maxwell. Not Ghislaine, but her older sister, Christine Maxwell. And the software that would, a few years later, end up running the FBI's main counterterrorism database, a single system holding 659 million records on people, came from a Maxwell also. It's becoming clearer and clearer that Epstein was some form of an intelligence asset and was, rubbing shoulders with spies. The Maxwells, a lot of people have said, were spies. But at the very least, if they weren't spies, they were something stranger and quieter and potentially more influential and dangerous. They were a data dynasty, controlling the flow of information, owning it, selling it, and steering it during essentially the second industrial revolution of the Western world. That is the era of modern data. Now, very scary, lots of information. A lot of it's based on a book called Fall by John Preston, and a lot of it is just from the internet, straight up. There's another book that is much darker and far more contested, and we'll get into that when we have to, but it's about the Maxwell family in regard to a lot of much darker, more contested stuff, to be fair. So we'll save the more conspiratorial aspects for later on in the video. So this video is about the Maxwell family, specifically Bob Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, who is the business partner of Jeffrey Epstein, notorious pedophile, and the heel of probably the biggest conspiracy theory that has ever existed to turn out as true. Anyways, if you're new, hit the subscribe button, press the like button if you want to see more, leave some ideas on what you want me to cover in the next video. And if you're old, may God have mercy on your soul. Anyways, this starts with a boy who technically didn't exist yet. The boy was born Jan Ludwig Hack, June 10th, 1923, in a dirt-poor village called Slatinske Doli, a forgotten corner of Czechoslovakia where a family of 9 could share just a room or two and still go hungry. Jan was a Yiddish-speaking Orthodox Jew raised in the side locks and the prayer shawl, pointed toward becoming a rabbi. There's almost no reliable records of those years, and that is pretty important because the man he became spent the rest of his life trying to make sure of that. Bob Maxwell was a notorious reinventor, and he reinvented himself so many times, so completely that by the end, he never really knew who he was, according to Preston in the book Fall. The reinventions started early, and they started with everything being taken from him. Around 1939, Jan, at just 15 years old, left. He walked out of his Czechoslovakian village and into Europe, a Europe that was closing like a fist on the Jewish people, if you guys weren't aware of World War II. In leaving Europe, old Bob put down the side locks, the Yiddish, the faith, the name, all of it. He changed his name to Bob. And after leaving, he never saw his mother, father, his grandfather, or most of his siblings ever again. Nearly his entire family would be murdered at Auschwitz. And by the time one of his sisters would see him again, she barely recognized him. The kid that had left as a shy religious student came back as a flashy young chap, the pre-war Central European equivalent of a teddy boy. This. He had already started building somebody new on top of the boy who had essentially lost everything. But of course, under that, he's still just the kid that, grew up where he grew up with who he grew up with. And there's a detail in Preston's book that said years later, at the height of his power, Bob Maxwell would sit and watch archival footage of the arrivals at Auschwitz, scanning the faces of the people being unloaded onto the platform, looking for his mother or his father. So with that and whatever else you make of him from what we've learned so far, his talent was absolutely real. It carried him across a burning continent. He talked his way out of terrible situations through Belgrade, Beirut, Marseille, and he reached Britain eventually. He joined the British Army, and then that little Czech village boy somehow got rid of his Czech accent and built an entirely new one. He built an upper crust English voice that he taught himself, and partly the story goes off of Winston Churchill's speeches from the radio. And for a while he served under a flatly English alias, Lance Corporal Leslie Smith. Then he fought fairly well in World War II. He was commissioned an officer, and in January 1945, he was awarded the Military Cross, which is Britain's decoration for gallantry for what's usually described as storming a German machine gun nest. The medal was pinned to his chest in the field by Field Marshal Montgomery himself. So a stateless young Jewish Czech refugee boy decorated by Monty on the field. That's genuinely insane. But of course, there are 2 other moments from the war that we cannot skip past. The first, Maxwell admitted in a 1945 letter home to his wife that he'd ordered a German town to surrender, sent in its mayor to deliver the message, and when a tank opened fire anyway, he wrote, "Luckily, he missed. So I shot the mayor and withdrew." The second, Maxwell also told on himself years later. There were German soldiers in a farmhouse, he called for their surrender, and then in his own words, "I shot them all with my submachine gun. I thought my boys would be pleased, but all they said was, 'That's not fair, sir. Those lads had surrendered.' Yeah, that's a war crime." A war crimes inquiry opened in his final years, and that was never made public until long after his death. It closed in 1992 without a charge, and we will come back to it. But for now, we've got a mid-20s young man that changed his name 4 times as he crossed Europe and finally landed on the name Robert Maxwell, old Bob Maxwell. He'd later deny most of his past outright. He told a Jewish newspaper flatly that he was not Jewish. He said, "I'm not Jewish." He completely reinvented himself. I'm not sure you can do that. So that's the young man, not an intelligence asset, not a spy in a trench coat, a survivor with an extremely special, weird, specific gift. He could look at a person, a market, or a pile of paper that nobody else wanted and see faster than anyone else in the room where the value was hiding. He was a master manipulator. And he also understood in his bones that information and people's data was worth more than anything, and specifically worth a lot of money. And that knowing things was just the whole game. And he built many fortunes off of that simple idea. And the very first fortune he built with that gift was built on the single most boring product I have ever put in one of these videos. Something so dull that you've just walked past it your entire life. And it's the reason that right now you can't read most of the world's science. The product was Sour Boys. Go to sour.gg to buy our new flavors of Sour Boys. I wasn't. Bob Maxwell didn't invent Sour Boys. I didn't invent Sour Boys. I just started the brand, started making candy with my friends and family, and now the business has grown so much that we have no idea what to even do with it. This is how many sessions we got this month. Huh? Are we blowing up right now? What's even happening? I am so grateful to have the products that we have and have the team that we have and that you guys like to buy the candy. It is genuinely so insane and life-changing for so many people around me. It's so cool. YouTube is a fucking gift from God. And then everything else that I've been able to do, all the privileges that I have, at the very tippy top, Sour Boys is #1 because it employs my mom, my sister, my dad, my childhood best friend, my fucking wife. Not that she needs it. She's fucking awesome and can do literally whatever she wants. But it's just this big thing that I completely love. It's still us, and I don't know. Sky's the limit, guys. Plus, we make the best gummies in the entire world. Our strips will be back very soon, but in the meantime, I implore you, buy one of our new flavors, 4 new flavors every single month. These are tangerine base. I can't remember exactly what flavor's in this little cup, but I had to put them away last week. I was eating too many of them. The jalapeno lime, I think I've eaten 15 bags of the jalapeno lime in the last 3 months. So anyways, go to sour.gg if you want to support the channel, if you want to support the team. It is the coolest thing that I've ever been a part of, and I'm incredibly grateful for you guys. You are the audience that helped start all of this for us, and I will never, I'll never be able to repay that, in all honesty. But if you get some candy, hopefully it's good, and hopefully you share it with your friends and you like it, and you brush your teeth after. Anyways, the rest of the video. Bob Maxwell's first product was The Scientific Journal. In 1951, Maxwell founded a publishing company called Pergamon Press, and what he worked out there is one of the quietly more brilliant and quietly more poisonous business ideas of the century, the 20th century as a whole. The trick is, scientists do research, usually paid for by universities or by the public through grants. Then they write it up and hand it to a journal for free. Other scientists check it for free, because it's science, and the journal then sells that research back to the very universities whose libraries literally cannot function without it. The labor is completely free, the demand never stops, and somehow Maxwell saw it before almost anyone else alive. Maxwell looked at it and saw a gold mine. So he went around the slow old academic societies and signed up scientists directly. Started launching journals by the 100, brand new one for every little subfield that he could find. And he created a machine. Research is not interchangeable. You can't decide one study is close enough and then just swap in another the way you'd grab like a different brand of cereal off the shelf. There's no substitute for the exact paper you need. So every journal that Maxwell launched became a tiny little monopoly. And if a serious library wanted to keep its researchers current, it had to buy all of them. He built thousands of figurative little greedy toll booths and planted one in front of every doorway in science. That's why to this very day, if you're not sitting inside of a university and you go to read a piece of publicly funded research, you hit a paywall with a price tag. It's insane. You can thank Bob Maxwell for that. By the early 1990s, Pergamon was running more than 400 scientific journals. But obviously, the information that only scientists wanted was never going to be enough for old Bob. So in the 1980s, he went after the kind that everyone consumes, mass media. He wanted to be Rupert Murdoch 2.0. Another man who understood that the real power isn't in making things, it's in controlling what people get to know. So he started buying the channels themselves. In 1981, he seized control of Britain's biggest printing company, the operation that he would eventually build into the Maxwell Communication Corporation. And in 1984, he bought Mirror Group Newspapers, which is the home of the Daily Mirror, one of Britain's biggest tabloids. In 1988, he bought the American publishing giant Macmillan for $2.6 billion. And in 1990, he launched a pan-European paper simply called The European. And obviously, he eventually bought the New York Daily News. So he went from selling scientific journals to a few thousand scientists to deciding what millions of people read during, let's say, breakfast. But it's the same idea each time, to be clear. You control information, you, in some sense, control the people who depend on that information. Now, he didn't get to the very end without trouble. The regulators had already seen through him once. Back in 1971, a British government inquiry looked at how he ran his business and delivered a verdict that would hang over him for the rest of his life. And that is that Bob Maxwell was not a person who can be relied on to exercise proper stewardship of a publicly quoted company. On the internet and in many a book, that Bob was trying to rebuild the family that Auschwitz took from him. Which is a theory that makes sense, but also some people just like having large families. I mean, my mom has 7 brothers and sisters. Not all of Bob Maxwell's children survived childhood with him. His eldest son, Michael, was in a car crash that left him in a coma. And that accident came just 2 days after Ghislaine was born at the end of 1961. He never woke up from that coma and died in 1968. Another child, Karine, had died of leukemia at 3 years old in 1957. But the ones who lived grew up inside the Maxwell machine, and they lived it and they breathed it and they absorbed it. 2 of the brothers, Ian and Kevin, followed their father straight into the business and then into the wreckage of that business. Both were charged with fraud after his death. Both were acquitted. Kevin even set a British record for a personal bankruptcy that was north of 400 million pounds. So son like father, but the genuinely scary ones are the daughters. They didn't just inherit a company and live exactly like their father. They took the ideas and then turned them into their own businesses. Starting with Christine, for sure, her father did hand her information on demand, but under her, it was plugged into more than 250 databases, pulling documents and data for businesses, hospitals, and labs. Then after that, she built a search engine. Her twin sister Isabel, with Isabel's husband David Hayden in the leadership alongside her. They called it Magellan. It was one of the competitors scrambling for ground in the early internet search engine wars, before Google even existed to win them. In 1996, they sold Magellan to a rival, Excite, for around $18 million, and then after this, Christine was not done. Not long or after, in the late 90s, she co-founded a company called Gilead. Gilead built advanced data mining software of the kind that could run a plain language question across enormous, messy piles of data without an analyst having to log into each separate system. Basically a consolidation platform or information curation a dashboard, if you will. Then after 9/11, that software ended up powering the FBI's counterterrorism investigative data warehouse. That's the system from the very beginning of the video. 659 million records. So in one career, the flow of information had run from a library brokerage to inside the American intelligence apparati. Christine's twin Isabel ran the other direction to the Middle East, towards Israel. Isabel became president of an Israeli email security firm called Comtouch. She took it public on the NASDAQ in 1999 with a $20 million investment from Microsoft and became a kind of pipeline carrying Israeli technology into Silicon Valley. And in her own words on the record, she called it a chance to continue her father's involvement in Israel. So look at the spread. Just from what we have documented that's public and easy to find. You got one generation of one family, scientific journals, chains of newspapers, information brokerages, search engines, Israeli security firms, counterterrorism databases with 600 million people inside of it. That is a crazy amount of power, and how the are these aren't like household names somehow. Now I mentioned that second much darker book in the very beginning. That is where it starts to come into the fold, because we have a talented family in the right decade. Sure, okay, maybe the dad was a piece of shit to do business with. The second book is a reading that alleges that none of this is even remotely close to any form of coincidence at all. There's no right decades, there's no guess. It is that this entire thing is a continuous intelligence operation by design. And that interpretation belongs to an investigative journalist named Whitney Webb in a long, very heavily sourced and very heavily contested book called One Nation Under Blackmail. So Whitney Webb, it's very important. Webb argues the family was deliberately controlling the world's sensitive information for intelligence services. And she's got all the same info that we have as her basis. Documented companies, FBI contract, filings, but her interpretation is the intent behind all of this, and that the idea that it was all on purpose or all connected or all aimed. So there's plenty of hard evidence and there's a lot of inference as well. And she's very clear about that and open and upfront. And disclaimer, before we go any further, Christine and Isabel are both alive and neither of them have ever been charged with anything. I'm telling you and talking about what they built. That part is completely documented in business filings, FBI files, stock listings, and so on. The very dark side of this makes a ton of sense, but it is Whitney Webb's story. So now we are left with the youngest daughter, Ghislaine. The favorite, the one that he named his boat after and the one her own brothers say was the most like him. She's the one who didn't build any software at all. She inherited the family's trade in its oldest, most disgusting, human, ugly form. In 1991, Robert Maxwell died and the floor fell out. And within days of his death, the truth started to surface. There were missing hundreds of millions of dollars, looted pension funds, and an empire built on debt and lies. The entire family was ruined. The fortune was a hole, and Ghislaine, the favorite, had fled to New York. By the way, the family wasn't ruined, obviously. But in New York, Ghislaine already knew a man named Jeffrey Epstein, and by most reporting, they'd met around 1991, and they became a couple by 1992. Although, some accounts put their first meeting a year or two earlier. Either way, the dating is a little bit murky, and it doesn't really matter, and okay, let's move on. So, back to Whitney Webb. This is what she builds her whole book around. And Webb's telling this is not a story about a broken girl falling for a very bad man. Ghislaine Maxwell was the one person on Earth who stood inside the entire machine while it was being built. This beast that has ruined our country and so many others. With the then coming age of information, Ghislaine watched her father turn information into money and money into power and power into friends that can make problems disappear and blah, 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 blah. And when his version collapsed, Webb argues that Ghislaine walked straight back into the family trade with a brand new partner and a brand new method. And if you look at what Epstein and Ghislaine actually built and ask what the business actually was, it's very similar. The famous black book full of the powerful, the girls, cameras wired into the walls of houses, flight logs, guest lists, surveillance gear he was documented buying. It's just leverage. It is the exact same thing, but in a new form that Bob Maxwell spent his life perfecting. Bob gathered leverage with printing presses and databases, and Epstein and Ghislaine gathered it with hidden cameras in guest rooms. And instead of it being for the masses, they gathered leverage on the people who already had leverage on the masses. The pedophilia and sex part of the entire Epstein thing is the very bottom rung. It's obviously bad and abhorrent in every single way, but it is a means to an end for them. Now, Webb's single biggest claim was that the Maxwell to Epstein handoff was an actual intelligence operation running since the 1980s, and this rests heavily on one man, a former Israeli intelligence official named Ari Ben Menashe. Ben Menashe told Webb he had personally seen a young, unknown Jeffrey Epstein inside of Robert Maxwell's office more than once back in the 80s. So that means the Epstein machine, in other words, was already running before any of us had ever even heard Epstein's name and before Ghislaine and him began a relationship. It's very important to note that this claim does rest on Ben Menashe, and Ben Menashe is a man whose reliability has been disputed. Governments and journalists have called him a fabulist, but who the knows nowadays with information warfare what's real and what's not, and what governments want to deceive and what they want you to spin and propagandize. Who's discrediting it? Let's look at that for one. And what does either side gain from their side being the one that's actually true? And I know you can feel where we're going with this. I know you can sense the word. You're waiting for me to say it. You're waiting for me to say that Ghislaine Maxwell's father was Mossad. and that the whole thing, Robert Ghislaine Epstein, it was one intelligence operation from start to finish, beginning out of Mossad and ending potentially with the CIA. So the fullest version of the intelligence spy story is a whole book of its own by the journalists Gordon Thomas and Martin Dillon, and the title is also the thesis, Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy. It isn't just some random guy speculating on the internet. They say that they built it on interviews with 54 people who had intimate knowledge of Maxwell, and in their telling, Maxwell's intelligence work began right after the war. He was interrogating captured Nazis. He was very good at it. British intelligence took notice. They say MI6 sized him up and classified him as a Zionist, loyal only to Israel, or a man to be watched, basically. And then once Israel existed and the Mossad existed, the story goes that Maxwell threw in with them, partly out of love for Israel, but mostly for how much money there was in it. There's also a very concrete operation that all hangs on. It's called Promise. Promise was software or a case management tool originally built for the US Justice Department by a small company called Inslaw. The allegation is that it was stolen from Inslaw, fitted with a secret Israeli backdoor, and then sold to intelligence services and governments all over the world so that every agency running it was unknowingly letting Israel read everything inside of it. And the salesman of that poison software, according to the whistleblowers, chief among those whistleblowers, that same former Israeli official, Ari Ben Menashe, was Robert Maxwell. This story even has a very interesting ending. As Maxwell sank towards bankruptcy, he tried to extort his Mossad handlers, essentially bail me out or I talk, and that is why, allegedly he had a heart attack and fell over the edge of his boat. So, best case, we have a bug Trojan horse sold to the world, and then a man murdered when he got greedy. That's what Thomas, Dillon, and Ben Menashe said, and also pretty much what Whitney Webb said. I don't say pretty much, I don't want to throw her in there as well, but there's a lot of crazy allegations in regard to all of this. Now, I also have to talk about the deconstruction of these things because these things have been investigated to death. I'm very late to the party. We're all very late in caring about this. In 1993, a special counsel, a retired federal judge named Nicholas Buah, was put on the Inslaw allegations and found no evidence of criminal conspiracy at the heart of the theory, meaning there was no Israeli backdoor. In 1994, the Justice Department reviewed it and concluded that there was no credible evidence that the department officials conspired to steal computer software developed by Inslaw Incorporated. But then, across 1997 and 1998, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims looked at the actual software and ruled that the versions in question were in public domain and that the government had always been free to do whatever it wished with Promise, so they could just kind of take it if they wanted. So the whole Promise spy story was investigated by special counsel, by the Justice Department, and a federal court, and that collapsed. So that's kind of the official story on Promise. Debunked, I guess. Now, how about the two witnesses that the spy story also leans on? Ari Ben Menashe, the man who put Epstein in Maxwell's office and named Maxwell as the Promise salesman, and Michael Riconosciuto, the chief Promise whistleblower. They were both, in official findings, judged to be fabricators. That is the record. They are fabricators. Fabulists, I guess. It gets worse for the legend. Maxwell was also famously ferociously litigious. He would sue anyone who breathed a word against him, and people point to his libel wins as proof that he beat the spy claims in court a while ago. He didn't, though. This is very important. His big libel win against the magazine Private Eye was over a story about cash for political honors, not the Mossad. The Mossad allegation he never did beat officially in court. And the one time it came straight at him when the reporter Seymour Hersh in his book The Samson Option alleged Maxwell's ties to Israeli intelligence, Maxwell sued. And then he died weeks later before any of it could be tested in a courtroom. And in 1994, his own mirror group quietly settled that case by paying Hersh's side damages and issuing an apology. So the one thing that could fully clear his name of the spy allegations ended right after his death with his side backing down. So, very interesting. The Samson Option also probably deserves its own video. I don't know, guys. What do you think? Oh, and also Bob Maxwell's death itself, the dramatic heart attack drowning at sea, the murder at sea. That does not hold still either. The official ruling was a heart attack and drowning, but of course, 3 pathologists who examined him could not agree on what actually killed him. The most investigated look at this is from Preston's book, one of the main ones from the very beginning of this video, and he refuses to call it murder. Preston says, "We don't really know. He most likely fell or jumped." Which, sure, I guess, he was under a lot of stress, but one of his own former editors, Roy Greenslade, was way blunter. He thought Maxwell simply went over on purpose, he just killed himself. In Greenslade's words, apparently Bob was a man who could not face the ignominy of jail or being shown to be a liar and a thief. Ignominy is a really cool word, by the way. It's what happens when you get canceled. You lose the respect of the public. So think what you will about the Israeli Mossad super spy intelligence operation spin. In my opinion, you know, you already know my opinion. What do you guys think down below? I feel like it's pretty fucking obvious at this point with the whole Epstein thing and Ghislaine's Maxwell. I mean, it just seems pretty fucking obvious, right? But either way, even if the spy isn't real, even if the massive conspiracy isn't real, even if Epstein was just a freak pedophile and it's just, you know, he wasn't hanging out with him in the 80s. The journals are real, the newspapers are real, the search engine was real, the information on demand was real, the FBI inquiry was real, Gilead was real, so was the 600 million record warehouse that they run, ComTouch was real, NASDAQ has a filing date on it. Every single brick in the Maxwell dynasty is very influential and very important, and that is all objectively real. Is death super mysterious? 3 pathologists could not agree on it. The timing of all the Israel stuff's crazy. There's so many books written on it of people speculating. The president of Israel, Chaim Herzog, stood at Maxwell's grave and said, "He scaled the heights of human endeavor. Kings and princes waited on him. Many admired him, many disliked him, but none was indifferent to him." I don't know what that voice is. Sounded kind of Israeli. Some people would say, well, if he was stealing from Mossad and blackmailing them and saying he's gonna flip and all this stuff, well, why would you bury him on the Mount of Olives? Why would you give him full honors? You don't give a hero's funeral to a traitor that you just executed on a boat. Well, you do though, honestly, you do that. Actually, you do. You're the only people who do kind of go out of their way to do that because it looks suspicious if not. So, just saying. So this whole video is about the fact that you don't have to be a big time spy, you don't have to do all this stuff, apparently, to get a ton of power and influence over a lot of people and be a massive piece of shit. There doesn't need to be a big cabal, there doesn't need to be an intelligence operation propping you up, apparently. You can just do it. All you gotta do is work really hard. Seems like. And it's just them, too. For both of them. It's not, nobody else is involved, not the family, not the kids, not anybody. Nobody knows anything about either of them. Nobody's officially invested, no governments are officially invested, but all of them just kind of, you know, we investigated and we found nothing. So anyways, thanks for watching. If you guys enjoyed this, press the like button and I will see you in the next video. And also let me know your own personal conspiracy and thoughts and how you think this all, you know, played out.